they echo under different names of the Chartists, the Serf, the tenants, the convicts, the colonised. This is about the geometry of control, how it shapes not only history but energetic resonance of place, stone and bloodline. It's those who have the money, hold the power, hold the vote, or held the vote, and still do to some degree. And from serfs to Chartists, it's the same thing. So it led me to go to Carmarthen Castle, and I started reading the information on Carmarthen. So Carmarthen Castle was built by William Fitz Baldwin in 1105 under the orders of Henry I. It was part Norman subjugation of Wales. It was a fortress of control both physically and symbolically. And during Elizabeth I's reign, the control shifted to centralised bureaucratic lords, still English and still ruling over Welsh land. So Carmarthen Castle, 1105, and Lorgon was granted by the monarchy, pronouncing it badly, who ruled over the local population, us, the working class and poor, the serfs. So, and the serfs, did you know, could not leave the land without permission, were tied to the manor through service and obligation, worked the land, maintained the estate, and gave up their share of all produce or labour, had no political rights, legal independence, or access to education. So not technically slaves, but not free either. And that continued, you know, for a number of years. I think the way the land was divided shifted in the late 19th century. So yes, they had houses and places to live, but often very poor and paid taxes. And I think each area that the manor house, the lord of the manor house owned, was ruled by the church, who managed the taxes and the law of each area. So serfs were tied to manors, workers tied to coal mines, colonised, tied to trade. Lords ruled the land, landowners owned factories, empires owned continents, bound by birth and place, bound by wage and poverty, bound by borders and debt. So a few controlled the land, many labour under systems they didn't create. So as I said, when I read that the Chartists had been shot, and I think these Chartists were possibly all over the UK, and they were sentenced to death or deported to Australia. I know that many women who had babies out of wedlock, those kids were also sent over to Australia, and I think as close as the 1970s, and Barnardo's was one of the big institutions involved in that. So, you know, that's another video. But, you know, Australia was a penal colony and Wales was a suppressed kingdom. England exported its overreach, you know, all the people it didn't want that didn't fit into the, you know, only in the margins like Wales, and then the wider world. So we're remembering how freedom was criminalised, dissent was exiled, and our place itself holds trauma, not just the people. So that took me down a similar rabbit hole again as what it's done before, because I for some reason the last few years I've been diving into the history of quite a few countries, seeing the connection between the UK and Australia and other countries, and why. So Australia, from penal outpost to promised land. So if you don't know much about Australia, listen to this bit. So initially between 1788 and 1868, why is it relative? Because of, you know, because I'm in Wales and lots of Welsh people were transported over there. So between those times, 160,000 convicts were forcibly transported from Britain, especially Ireland and Wales, to Australia. The British used this system to relieve overcrowded prisons, remove the undesirable poor, and quiet political dissent, like the Chartists or the Irish rebels or the Luddites, populate new land without direct military conquest. So the convicts were sent to New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, Western Australia later, Norfolk Island for repeat offenders. Once their sentence was served, however, they often became free settlers, land granted in exchange for loyalty, labour and assimilation into colonial order. There was a second phase, free settlers and strategic colonisation. As the British realised that the land immense agricultural and mineral wealth, they shifted from viewing Australia as a penal sinkhole to a strategic imperial asset. Wealthier British families and ambitious settlers began to arrive by choice, establishing pastoral empires, vineyards, sheep stations, and mining towns. Land was granted or purchased already occupied by Aboriginal people whose legal status was nullified under the terra nullius, which is the land belonging to no one. These settlers moved westward and northward, laying claim to fertile valleys, arid grasslands, and gold-rich territories. So those same ships carried prisoners became vessels of aspiration. The land stripped from its first people became the reward for the colonial loyalty. Trauma and opportunity were stacked in the same geography. Collapse and expansion are engineered into the same field, so no one questions the foundation. So it's likely that, you know, when you walk through one space and you pick up this, who knows how many of the voices and the stories that you're also picking up, you know. So the strange silence of continent whose ancient memory was overwritten in just 200 years. The echo of the convicts who became settlers and settlers who became rulers, and the Aboriginal displacement and genocide. Australia holds one of the densest memory fields in post-colonial world. Both beauty and betrayal is encoded in the soil. So, on a previous exploration of children who were moved around Australia, or should I say, robbed or kidnapped, you know, it doesn't matter what language you use, they're taken out of their families without agreement. When I was exploring more about the mixed race experience around different parts of the world, because for those who are interested in the deeper politics of race, class, gender, will realise this, you know, the subtle interplay with it all of those who are seen as worthy and those who aren't. So the echo of the exiled, you know, thinking about the convicts who were going into exile and then the carriers, free settlers seeking land. So, you know, we see the punished, the privileged, and the silence between, remembering the land before the ledger. Asking none of it, just noticing, just knowing that happened. The penal colony, the plantation, the reserve, the boarding school, the slave ship, the poorhouse, the asylum, the empire, not just separate phenomena, iterations of the same distortion, the geometry of dominance, the system of severance. So this section, again, I've only got to Newport. I've still got to do videos of the other several areas I've been to, so do stay tuned. Now, if you like me going deeper, and this ties in a lot with my professional and personal work actually, over the years I've spoken much less about. This is the complex zone of race, mixedness and language, because it reminded me of when I was trying to figure things out for my masters. I was asking questions and having children from a mixed race marriage and experiencing various cultures and cultural identities and belief systems and value systems. It made me ask some very deep questions over 30 years ago, which I'd kind of asked when I was growing up, but I didn't have a place to put it. I didn't have a language to describe it. It was only when I got married and started doing research that I worked out why. So language became law, education, science and culture, even parenting. In Britain and America especially, race was not just a category, it was a system of hierarchy. So white became the baseline, unmarked and centred, and black, coloured, mulatto, half-caste, or even quadroon were terms used for different mixed identities. Please don't complain about the language I'm using. These are terms that were used. And there are some strange terms that are still used in different parts of the world. I'm describing how we use language to divide, control, or erase. Language can become a weapon, not just to describe, but decide who belongs, who could love, who was normal, who could be taken. So Yasmin Alibhai-Brown wrote 2 books. Oh, what was the name of the first book? Because she interviewed from the 1960s right up to the 2000s, I think. The Colour of Love, that was it. Mixed race families, you know, a white woman with an African, a Chinese woman with a Catholic, you know, many different mixes, but it was much less common back then. And she interviewed people and they shared their stories. If you want to read more about the mixed race families and couples, marriages and experiences, some beautiful stories in there. But you know, again, on both hands, there is love and joy, and as pain and fractured pasts and histories and racism and all sorts of stuff. And of course, being in the Welsh area and Bristol, there's lots of mixed race kids that were born in these areas for 2 particular sort of seasons. Really, is when the American GIs came over, and I'm reading in from oh God, what's the book called? I was looking at it today. It's looking at dating from like the 1900s right up to Tinder. The Curious History of Dating, from Jane Austen to Tinder. And that looks at relationships, dating and marriage from the early 1900s, and it's fascinating. So it goes into what the rules were for soldiers who came over and women who had kids and what happened to these kids. So Bristol and Wales also has this etched into its history and into the psyche. But focusing back on Australia, the Stolen Generations, there was a film I watched a few years ago, and it was, oh God, it was so sad. Rabbit Proof Fence, and it's not fiction. It's between the 1800s, 1970, thousands of Aboriginal children in Australia were forcibly taken by their families by government and church authorities. These children, often mixed descent, were placed in missions or white foster homes, forbidden to speak their language, renamed and assigned new identities, taught to be ashamed of their ancestry. The justification that half-caste children could be bred out into whiteness. Aboriginal culture was seen as inferior, doomed or primitive. Background of kids, and there's lots of kids who are walking around who look white now, who had a mother or father that wasn't white, that was black or African, and especially the grandchildren. We know a few families like that. So, and I'm going to go much more deeper into that when I do a separate piece of work on my master's, because I did it as an autobiographical piece, looking at my own history, my own cultural influences, and how they're all connected to race, class, gender, and culture. So, what we touched on already before I got to Newport, but also the impact that Newport had, is all of this information was coming through me, and it was about serfdom. I only came across that term a few years ago. I didn't realise that all of us poor working class that worked on the farms or whatever were serfs, you know. And this whole, oh God, this spiked off in so many different arenas. And the industrial resistance in Newport, but also that was reflected in other parts of the country, because I went to an exhibition, a photography exhibition in Margate a few months ago. If you see, there's a video on my YouTube page, and that was all about the uprisings over the last, I don't think it was 100 years, it might have been 70 years, all over different parts of the UK. It's a brilliant photography Christian. And it really reminds us of the different times, like when we had the poll tax march, you know, this ridiculous notion that it would tax everyone in the family. And thankfully that they didn't get away with it. But lots of marches over the years where people are just forced into feeling repressed and pushed and pulled and struggling to just keep their head above water, let alone put food on the table, you know. So it's connecting some of the work that I've done, and again, not for this video, but I did with therapists. I ran some workshops several years ago, whether it was mostly white therapists, perceived as white, I should say, politically white, or may have even called themselves white, but in a room, the therapist mostly white, where we looked at these conversations and how do we have conversations without people getting upset, angry, triggered, or scared of saying the wrong thing. And sadly, that's still an issue, and that's what stops people. That's what stops us. If we start capitalizing on language and saying what we can and can't say, then people just shut down even more, and we just can't have conversations and know it's okay to mess things up and say things, you know, that you don't necessarily mean in that way. And that can be really tough. And in therapy game, you know, we're meant to be open and receptive to helping people have those conversations. And so the video's gone completely dark, so I'm now sat in the dark. So you should be able to see that all of this came to me as a result of just going past, coming out Portishead through Bristol, and I did look at some of the other areas, and then ended up in Newport. So the next video will cover Cardiff. Where else did I go? Cardiff Bay, Barry, Llantwit Major, Moncat, Ogmore-by-Sea, and I went through Bridgend and Porthcrawl. So a few more places coming up, and that's before I even got to Swansea. So we're probably talking about 3 legs of a trip so far. So I hope you've enjoyed listening. Like and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you're not on there, if you're listening on Spotify. Leave me a comment what you think.